Dr. Robert E. Weems, Jr., who is the Willard W. Garvey Distinguished Professor of Business History at Washburn University. And we are, I'm really excited today. We are here to talk about what's the big idea. Professor Weems wrote a big idea for Humanities Kansas on It's Time to Tell the Stories of African American Entrepreneurs. And this is really great because in addition to being a distinguished professor at Washburn, I'm sorry, Wichita State, two W's there, got him confused. Dr. Weems is also a community scholar. So he is involved in lots of community-based activities as well, including being on the boards of the Kansas African American Museum, the African American Council of Elders, and the Wichita Chamber of Commerce. So as you can imagine, all of this has earned him many accolades, including most recently the H.N. Sims Excellence in Education Award given by the Wichita branch of the NAACP, and the Alfred Nelson Marquis Lifetime Achievement Award given by Marquis Who's Who in America. So we have somebody really completely awesome here to talk to us about the big idea. And what is the big idea? The big idea is a Humanities Kansas initiative showcasing fresh ideas from humanities scholars that spark conversations about ideas that shape our world. And we are just going to get right to it. So welcome, Dr. Weems.
Glad to be here. And before we get started, I've noticed a person on the call that I have to give a shout out to. Antonio Holland was a colleague that I knew when I was back at the University of Missouri, Columbia. He was the chair of the history department at Lincoln University. And Professor Holland, it's good to see you.
Good to be here.
All right. So like I said, we're going to talk about your big idea. It's time to tell the stories of African American entrepreneurs. So let's just start out with the definition of entrepreneur. In your essay, you talk about the opportunities and the lures of being an entrepreneur for Blacks, but that there are also additional risks. So can you expand on that?
Well, I think, one of the unfortunate realities of being a person of African descent in the United States is that you're not going to have the same opportunities that your counterparts of European descent have. And this is in all areas, and especially in the realm of business. For instance, when we look at the history of African American entrepreneurship, one of the lingering issues or concerns is access to capital. We know that to start any enterprise, you need, access to capital. And again, this is something that is a historic as well as a national phenomenon, because in fact, when I talk to various entrepreneurs in Wichita for my Wichita Black Business History Project, several individuals shared with me a lot of horror stories in terms of their relationship with local banks and how literally people had to be very creative in terms of finding the money to either start an enterprise or to sustain a pre-existing enterprise. So I would say, the number one obstacle that African American entrepreneurs have faced and continue to face is in the realm of access to capital.
Yeah. And what about challenges within their own communities? You mentioned insurance companies in your essay.
Well, one of the problems that people have faced in the African American, entrepreneurs is the question of competition. And this is linked with the issue of capital. A lot of times African-American enterprises with limited capital or limited access to capital, they end up having establishments that have sort of limited, ambiance or limited attractiveness, especially when they're competing with whites and members of other ethnic groups who have more access to capital, and they could present, a better looking establishment. They could have a wider variety of goods within that establishment. And also too, there's a lingering issue that I talk about in the essay, and the question of how African Americans view African American entrepreneurs in terms of their competence. One of the things that I think we're probably going to ask me about, the question of, the white man's ice being colder.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that is one of the, historic and lingering concerns, faced by Black entrepreneurs. And in fact, I've done I've given a lot of thought, and I've done some additional research on this question as to why, and I need to preface all of this, that based upon racism, we know that many whites are going to be apprehensive about doing business with African American entrepreneurs. But again, when we look at, the root of this white man's ice, it's colder. And in my own thinking and research, I literally have traced it back to the transatlantic slave trade, and specifically the negotiations that took place on the African continent. Now, one thing about slavery, even though the most despicable business you could be engaged in is the buying and selling of human beings, but in order to understand slavery, we have to look at it as a business. And that business, or the dynamics of that business, actually began on the African continent, where you had European merchants that brought in guns and other trinkets, and they sold them to representatives of various African ethnic groups in exchange for excess prisoners of war that these ethnic groups would get by having access to guns. And in the final analysis, when we look at this commercial transaction that took place between European merchants and representatives of African ethnic groups, it's very clear who got the best part of that deal. Because again, when you go into any type of economic transaction, you want to get at least as much as you put in, and hopefully more. And when we look at the European merchants and their interaction with Africans, they were able to get prisoners of war that were transported here as enslaved people, and they helped to build this economic juggernaut we know as the United States of America. And conversely, when we look at what the Africans got in this regard, these weapons that literally represent the seeds of self-destruction, because there had been pre-existing ethnic conflict before the introduction of guns. But when guns were introduced to these pre-existing ethnic conflicts, they became dramatically accelerated, and it contributed to significant destabilization. So yeah, there's a lot of nuances to we talk about why, Black people in particular, and looking at, white entrepreneurs, Black entrepreneurs feel that, white entrepreneurs are intrinsically better. But I think there's a variety of historic dynamics, related to this point.
Yeah, and as you were talking, it made me think too, a couple of things. One, that, dating back to slavery, right, that Blacks are seen as the workers, not the boss, right? They're the laborers. And then two, going back to what you were saying before, is like access to capital is, the dearth of Black-owned banks as well. Have you come across any in Wichita or in any of your research, Black-owned banks?
Well, in fact, there was an attempt to start a Black-owned bank in the 1970s. The name of it was University Bank. Also, there was an attempt to establish an African-American credit union called Communities Invited. And I'm glad you asked that question, because the case study of Communities United represent yet another serious obstacle that African-American entrepreneurs have had to deal with. The founders of Communities United, they were in contact with the federal agency that helps to underwrite and fund credit unions. Mm-hmm. And representatives from Communities United were under the impression that they would be getting funding which would allow them to open up as a full service financial institution, so they could offer a variety of services to their clients. As it turns out, Communities United received a far lesser amount of money to get started. Thus, they were able to operate at a much lower level. And again, in this context of sort of comparing, an African-American institution to a predominantly white institution, this was yet another instance of, a Black enterprise appearing to be substandard. But this had nothing to do with the expertise of the people behind Communities United. It had everything to do, from my, analysis of this episode, of deliberately being undercut by a federal agency. And Communities United was never really able to become a full-fledged credit union, and ultimately went out of business within 4 or 5 years.
Yeah. So another example is the systemic racism in our society right there. Definitely. Let's talk about the kind of the converse, and that is what were historically and what are in current day the ripple effects of Black-owned businesses, particularly in Black communities, and why are they so needed, and why is this so important?
Yeah, when we look at sort of the historic role of African-American enterprises in Black communities, they oftentimes represented more than just a commercial enterprise. They were often seen as community-based enterprises that, among other things, generated a great deal of community pride. I talk quite a bit in my essay about, African-American insurance companies, and that wasn't by coincidence, because when we look at the history of African-American business in this country, Black insurance companies were the most stable over time. We look at Black banks. Black banks, many of them were casualties of the Great Depression and really didn't reappear in a significant way until the late 1950s and moving into the 1960s. Conversely, we saw Black insurance companies that were able to survive the Great Depression. And more from a psychological standpoint, a lot of Black insurance companies, as well as Black banks, built very solid and very imposing financial structures. Their home offices and what have you were located in African-American communities, so people could walk by and see, this imposing structure and say, yeah, this is a demonstration of what our people can do when we, cooperate economically. So there has been this historic sense of Black businesses being more than just enterprises run by individuals, but they were also seen as community enterprises. And unfortunately, with the advent of racial desegregation, one of the casualties from the context of the African-American community has been its economic infrastructure, because one by one, we have seen, the Black insurance industry today is pretty much extinct. There's a couple remaining companies that are pretty much on life support. Black banks appear to be moving in a similar direction. And while you do have a lot, because for instance, we look at, the annual, well, they're not annual censuses of business activities, but there's periodic censuses of business activity in the United States. And in recent decades, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of Black businesses in the United States, which is good news. But the bad news is most of these are single proprietorships that tend to be very tenuous in terms of their financial stability. And there's a clear correlation between, a business that has employees and being able to sustain itself versus a single proprietorship, many of which go out of business within, the first 5 years of their existence.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this whole notion of community and pride, and when those businesses are in the community, right? Other community members see those role models. They see those business owners, the Black dentist or doctor.
Exactly, and to carry it even further. One of the more important, and I didn't discuss this in the essay, but one of the more important African-American owned businesses in the early 20th century were the Negro baseball leagues. And above and beyond, their importance, and again, we know the Kansas City Monarchs was one of the more famous of the Negro leagues. And from a business standpoint, the Negro leagues, while it was a self-contained entity, it also helped auxiliary community businesses, because before and after the game, people would go to, restaurants in the African-American community. They would go to watering holes in the African-American community. And when the Negro leagues disappeared, you had a corresponding decline in some of these auxiliary businesses as well. And one other point I want to get in here, we talk about the importance of businesses and Black communities, is related to the question of the rotating dollar. In a healthy economic environment, for instance, if we use the Negro Leagues as an example, somebody went to a Negro Leagues game and the owner of that team would spend money with a local laundry, and that laundry person would spend that dollar with a local restaurant. We saw the money pretty much circulating within that community, whereas today, with the decline of a lot of community-based African-American businesses, dollars pretty much take a quick one-way trip out of the African-American community into downtown and suburban shopping areas.
Or online, right? In this day and age. So I was thinking about what you said about, the Great Depression and how African-American insurance companies survived that. What about other, significant economic and community things? So here I'm thinking of, in Topeka, we had this thriving African-American community on 4th Street that was completely demolished with urban renewal. So, urban renewal, recessions, these days, gentrification kind of coming in and, dispersing, these communities, and also the current pandemic. What is this effect on African-American entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I want to talk about the earlier period, and then I'll talk about the pandemic. One of the real historic challenges that African-American communities and African-American entrepreneurs in particular face commencing in the 1950s was the building of interstate highways. Literally, when we look across the country, interstate highways were pretty much built right in the middle of pre-existing African-American communities. And that resulted in a significant dislocation of that pre-existing sense of community. And to bring this closer to home, in my project looking at business here in Wichita, many people shared with me the negative impact of the building of I-135, which literally went right in the middle of Wichita's African-American community. And some have argued that the community has never really recovered from that. And we see similar situations across the country. And I did some research on interstate highway building a few years back, and I came across, this is kind of humorous but sad. They were talking about the building of interstate highways in Minneapolis. And the author made the point that, there weren't a whole lot of people in Black folks in Minneapolis, but the highway builders found them and in fact put the highway right in the middle of their communities. Mm-hmm. But going back to the pandemic, one of the things that concerns me, both on a macro level as well as a micro level. On a macro level, when we look at small business in general, we're pretty much seeing the disappearance of small business in America in general. If you look at some of the numbers in terms of the decline and disappearance of small business in general over the past couple months, it's pretty stunning. But when you look at Black-owned small businesses, and most Black-owned businesses are in the realm of small business, it's even more disastrous because many Black-owned businesses, especially smaller Black-owned businesses, were not able to get access to the PPP funds that some of the larger small and even some big businesses through cronyism and fraud were able to get access to. And again, in this very tenuous time that we find ourselves in, I'm personally concerned, personally as well as professionally concerned, whether or not 3 or 4 years from now, there will even be a significant small, Black business community, in the United States.
Yeah, and it seems like, such an irony, because in this pandemic time, it would be a time to, kind of focus inward and on your small community, right? Because we don't want to be traveling or, whatnot. But, the reality is it's so easy to click on, your computer and order something off of there versus, driving down the street to the local hardware store or what have you. So it's this catch 22.
Yeah, well, again, I think when we look at business in general, it's not hyperbole to say that if current trends, manifest themselves, the two primary retailers that'll be left in America are, Amazon and Walmart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's sad. We won't have people like Anthony Overton. And I wanted to bring up your new book, The Merchant Prince of Black Chicago. And as I just said, this is about Anthony Overton. So can you tell us more about him and why he's so important, why we need to know about him? Because I think we all do.
Okay, Anthony Overton, and interestingly enough, as a prelude to my comments, there's a definite Kansas connection to the Anthony Overton story. But, in terms of his background, he was born in Monroe, Louisiana. His father was a noteworthy entrepreneur and politician in post-Civil War Louisiana. And when ex-Confederates, retook control of that region in the late 1870s, Anthony Overton's father was targeted for assassination, and literally the Overton family was part of the group that participated in the Exoduster movement, and the Overton family ended up moving to Topeka. And Anthony Overton, had very, very interesting background. At one point in time, he was a law student at the University of Kansas. He participated in the Oklahoma land rush of 1889. And he established his cornerstone business, the Overton Hygienic Manufacturing Company in Kansas City, Missouri in 1898. And he later moved operations to Kansas City, Kansas. And literally, when he moved to Chicago in 1911, he in fact moved from Kansas City, Kansas. And one thing about Overton, and I think it's something that's true in all of our lives, we are where we are based upon the decisions we've made, both good and bad. And from a commercial standpoint, one of the best decisions that Anthony Overton made was early on. The Overton Hygienic Manufacturing Company specialized in baking powder and various extracts used in cooking. But about 4 or 5 years into business, Anthony Overton came up with the idea of, developing a facial powder for Black women. And that ultimately became the High Brown face powder, which represented, the cornerstone of his later, cosmetic empire. And it's interesting too, and I talk about this in the book, that when we think about the embryonic African-American personal care products industry, the first names that come to mind are people like Madam C.J. Walker and Annie Malone. But Anthony Overton, in fact, was a major player in that realm. And literally, I look at Overton as a man in a woman's world. And as I talk about in the book, Anthony Overton was able to use his daughters to, in fact, help market company products. As sort of an aside, when we look at, Madam C.J. Walker and Annie Malone, a lot of their marketing strategy was based upon the use of their own products, the proverbial before and after pictures. Since Anthony Overton was a man, he couldn't, use that type of marketing strategy. Ultimately, he incorporated his daughters to help market products. After Anthony Overton moved to Chicago, which turned out to be a fantastic move for him in terms of a businessman, he was able to branch out into banking. He was able to branch out into insurance. In fact, in 1927, Anthony Overton was the first business person to win the NAACP Spingarn Medal. And that's an award given to, an annual award given to, African Americans of distinction. And in 1927, a major reason why Anthony Overton got the Spingarn Medal was that the insurance company he started in 1924, Victory Life, was the first Black-owned insurance company that was able to do business in the state of New York. The state of New York had very strict requirements in terms of companies being able to do business there. And that was a big thing for Victory Life to be able to do business there. And literally after that, because the title of the book is, The Merchant Prince of Black Chicago, but after Anthony Overton won the Spingarn Medal, he had the, honorific title of the Merchant Prince of his race. But unfortunately for Anthony Overton, as what happened with a lot of businessmen, the Great Depression pretty much dramatically, negatively impacted his enterprises. And at the end of the 1930s, he had lost, most of his financial career. But, when he died in 1946, he was still a respected, business person. And to this day, the Harvard Business School they have a database of great American business leaders of the 20th century. And Anthony Overton is listed as the first African American to head a major business conglomerate.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. I'm going to open it up here to some questions from our audience, and we've got some really good ones. So first, from Wilma, what are some examples that you've discovered that Blacks made a way out of no way to endure and become successful entrepreneurs?
That's a great question. And I talk about that in the essay in sort of a broader context. When we look at, and this goes back to the question of capital, when we look at the African American community, when enslavement ended, most people entered quote unquote freedom with little more than the clothes on their back. They were in a very hostile environment, but within a generation, we saw African Americans building a very impressive business infrastructure. And to me, when I reflect on that period from the late 1860s to the early 1900s, especially in terms of African American business formation, it's literally nothing short of miraculous. Again, how people that were in a very disadvantaged position in the society were able to construct a very respectable, business infrastructure. And I think that earlier period has set the precedent for later instances of African Americans in business and in other areas literally succeeding against the odds.
Yeah, that puts a really new spin on what you were saying about Anthony Overton too, right? And his family being exodusters coming to Kansas as well. Yeah. Well, we have a question from Leslie, and her question is, are the public policies in place or ones that are currently being discussed that could strengthen Black-owned small businesses? For example, lending policies or small business administration loans. Is there anything specific to African American owners?
Well, and that's a great question. When we look at the SBA in particular, and the SBA have a very interesting history as it relates to African Americans. Early on, when the SBA was founded in 1953, and for its first decade of existence, it did not service African American entrepreneurs, but based upon some of the developments of the 1960s, we do see, African Americans being included in SBA programs. One of the more popular programs was the 8A program, where African American entrepreneurs were able to get access to government contracts to help start their businesses. And several people that I talked to in my study of African American entrepreneurs in Wichita, noted that, the SBA was a very important source. Another important point in terms of the SBA, one of the persons that I spoke with was the African American head of the Wichita SBA office, Wayne Bell. And Wayne makes a point, and this is sort of related to Leslie's question. Wayne makes the point, and I think about this a lot when I sort of get into my pessimistic mode, is that Wayne makes the point that, notwithstanding the history, we're all aware of the history, and the history is very unsavory and negative as it relates to the support of African American entrepreneurs. But Wayne makes the point that, there are a lot of programs that pretty much go underutilized by some African-American entrepreneurs, because some people, based upon the history, sort of go in thinking, well, yeah, they're not going to, take my business plan seriously, or this or that. So it's a lot of things going on when we talk about, public policy, but I think a lot of it too. And as a historian, I'm very well aware of the importance of history, but there are some times where we have to look beyond history and realize that, 2020 is not 1920. And that indeed, there are some opportunities that are available for the enterprising and aggressive entrepreneur. But be that as it may, this is not to, minimize the fact that, racism and systematic racism is alive and well. But this goes back, I think, to the essence of being an entrepreneur. And I'm not an entrepreneur myself, but I've talked to a lot of entrepreneurs over the years. And entrepreneurs tend to be very persistent. Entrepreneurs tend not to take no for an answer, or not to take the first 5 no's for an answer. And again, I think there's something about the entrepreneurial spirit that, and this is something that transcends race, but in terms of African Americans, and based upon our special history, that people that really want it, and going back to Wilma's point about taking a way out of no way, people that really want it ultimately do find a way of making things happen.
Yeah, lots of resilience and grit in there. So we have a question from Brianna. What can we do to help promote the Black Chamber of Commerce? And what do you recommend that they can do to help the Black community?
That's a great question. In fact, I'm on, as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm on the board of directors of the Heartland Wichita Black Chamber of Commerce, which has been in existence now for about 5 to 6 years. From what I understand, there were some earlier attempts to jumpstart a Black Chamber of Commerce, which weren't successful for a variety of reasons. I think that the Heartland Wichita Black Chamber of Commerce has really gotten off to a good start. We have established a good track record. One of the things, and I like the two-part question, what can the Chamber of Commerce do to enhance, potential members? And one of the things that the Chamber has tried to do and will expand upon is offering services to prospective and pre-existing entrepreneurs. Basic things as, how to write a lesson plan, because quite frankly, you could have the best idea in the world, but if you don't have it in a coherent fashion that would make prospective lenders and investors excited about what you want to do, you're pretty much not going to get anywhere. One of the things that I feel personally good about, that I think has helped the Chamber, and this was linked with my research on local African American entrepreneurs, is that the Chamber has established the Wichita Black Business Hall of Fame, and literally we have inducted classes every year since 2015, and above and beyond, helping to give notoriety to people who otherwise may not have gotten this notoriety. The Chamber sees this as a means to perhaps stimulate younger people to think about, going into entrepreneurship as a career. Clearly, COVID-19 has brought to a screeching halt, a lot of the activities that the Chamber was involved in, and some of the plans that we had for 2019. But I can say that the Chamber, is, working on some plans. So when the health situation changes, that the chamber will be able to hit the ground running.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like too a great way not just to promote Black-owned businesses, but also to set up those role models for those youth, right? Like you were talking about, and and to give witness to the history of those businesses in Wichita, which is what I want to talk about next. Is you created,
and I want to piggyback off the point you made about role models that I think is very important, and especially when we talk about African-American entrepreneurship and why people choose to become entrepreneurs. Most of the people that I interviewed in my study of Black entrepreneurship in Wichita noted that they either had a family member or a relative or someone that they really respected who was an entrepreneur that served as a role model for them to even consider that. Because when we look at the demographics of most Black families, we're talking about, for a variety of reasons, people that are job oriented. And indeed, in a lot of families, people are told, you go to school, you do this or do that to get a good job. In a lot of Black families, you're not getting that message that, yes, being an entrepreneur is also a very good avenue to take. So again, the question of role models seems very crucial in terms of why some, African Americans, choose to take the path of the entrepreneur. I'm sorry, but I did want to, make that point.
Oh no, because that's a perfect segue into what I was going to say, which is I wanted you to tell us a little bit more about the Wichita African American Business Project. What was the inspiration for its start? And is there a story from the project that stands out the most? I listened to one. I listened to Vernon Smart's story. So this is a series of interviews that Dr. Weems did with Wichita business persons, African American business persons. And one of my takeaways from Vernon's story was that he worked one job for the man and one job for himself. And I just thought, that was.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, to answer that question, and I allude to this in the essay, when we look at, the African-American experience in general, probably the most understudied aspect of the African-American experience is the African-American business experience. And as someone who studies that experience, part of my mission, if you will, in that regard, is to try to document as much as possible things that African Americans have done in the realm of business. And quite frankly, my interest in this type of project preceded my coming to Wichita. It was something that, I had some stuff written down that, yeah, if I'm ever in a situation to do this, I want to do this. And as fate would have it, I came to Wichita and had the opportunity to institute this project. And in that regard, I do want to give a public shout out to former Councilwoman Levanta Williams in Wichita, who at the time when I came to Wichita was also the president of the local branch of the NAACP. And when I got to Wichita, the history department gave a reception for me, and they invited a variety of community people. And Levanta was one of the people that was invited, and I sort of gave a spiel about who I was and what I wanted to do. And afterwards, Levanta came up and said, Dr. Weems, people need to know you're here. And as it turns out, a couple weeks after this reception was the annual Freedom Fund banquet of the NAACP, where literally I had an opportunity for about 8 or 9 minutes to introduce myself to the community and talk about some of my research interests. And to me, this was very, very important, because when you're a new person in a community, people don't know who you are. And if you talk about, asking people questions about their experiences, like, why should I talk to you? So Levanta really, again, I'm always be indebted to her for opening up doors for me to meet people. And one of the beautiful things about this project was that people were very open. People told me, the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of their experiences as Black entrepreneurs in Wichita. But going back to your question about the faith, there were, all of them were good, but one interview that was, to me, very interesting and important, and this goes back to the SBA as an example, Ed Givens. Ed Givens established a company called Givens Restoration, which is a cleaning and custodial service, started in the 1970s. It's a legacy business that's run by his sons today. And when I asked Mr. Givens, why he started or why he wanted to be and he had no previous experience as an entrepreneur, but he said, I just wanted to do something more for my family. And with that motivation about wanting to do something more for his family, he hooked up with the SBA, got training, went on to win several awards from the SBA. And to me, this is a classic example of someone that, started off with a good idea and motivation and subsequently got the training to become a successful entrepreneur, and more important, to establish a legacy business. Because again, when we talk about African-American entrepreneurship, we see relatively few legacy businesses. Another important legacy business here in Wichita was one started by Charles McAfee, the world-renowned architect. He ultimately brought his daughters into the business, and he started, the business in the 60s, and that business is still going strong today. So again, there were a lot of very, good stories that people shared with me. And again, I'm just very thankful that they felt comfortable enough with me to be very honest and open about their experiences.
And if anybody wants to listen to those, we've shared the link to the project in the chat. We have a question. I think this might be our last question from Kent. He's a former student of yours from the University of Missouri, and he has a couple of questions. Can you give us some historical examples of Black women's roles in business ownership uncovered by your research? And he would also like to know more about the effects of the 1919 riots and its larger implications on the vast network of Black businesses throughout the region. So from Tulsa to Wichita, Topeka, Kansas City, and I think we could even go up to Chicago with, 1919 riots there.
Yeah, first of all, in terms of African-American, female entrepreneurship, again, in the context of the Anthony Overton project, necessarily I had to find out a lot more about, Madam C.J. Walker and Annie Malone. And when we look at their business models, even though Annie Malone and Madam C.J. Walker were competitors and there was some bad blood between them, the business model that they set up was very, very powerful. They allowed Black women the opportunity to move beyond just working in domestic service and other types of menial activities to make a good living as cosmetologists. And that was indeed, I think, very, very important, because both Madam C.J. Walker and Annie Malone and others, because there were other Black women who established their own sort of beauty culture systems, they made a point of training other Black women who could go out and, in fact, make money in a more dignified way than simply working as a washerwoman or a domestic servant, service work, or the like. Now, the 1919 question is real interesting. Since I've been in Wichita, I came to find out that there were some people, who after the, racial war of 1921 that left Tulsa and migrated to Wichita. And indeed, in Wichita, the 1920s was, like other parts of the United States, was a sort of proverbial golden age of Black business. Because in fact, there's a business and community directory of Wichita, Black Wichita in 1923, which clearly outlines a nice variety of African-American enterprises in a variety of sectors. And in some of the editorials in this particular directory, there were, messages saying that, business is good and we need to support, Black-owned businesses and the like. But yeah, to answer that question even further, when we look at what happened in 1919, where you had literally the Red Summer, the so-called Red Summer, where you had whites literally attacking Black people in urban enclaves across the country, that fortified Black people's resolve to literally build up their communities. Because in fact, during the 1920s, we saw the appearance of the so-called Black metropolis movement, where we saw African Americans literally attempting to build, cities within cities, where Black people would control, the economic and social and political life of these areas.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a really informative and interesting discussion, and I appreciate all of you for joining us. If you haven't already, please check out Dr. Weems' big idea. It's time to tell the story of African-American entrepreneurs on the Humanities Kansas website. He also lists, further reading and further viewing for you to learn more about this topic. So.
And I would just like to personally thank everybody for coming out today, because you all had other things you can be doing, but you took the time to come out today. I really appreciate that.
So thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
I guess that's it. Again, thanks everybody for coming out.